Now, why would law enforcement want to flood their own tip line in the Idaho 4 case? Hey everybody, it's Lucky with Unfiltered Lucky, and I hope that everybody had a great day yesterday for the Christmas holiday. Now today, I want to talk about this white four-door Hyundai. The Hyundai. This is the same car that law enforcement is basically building their case around. Now, on December 7th, law enforcement announced that they were looking for a 2011 to 2013 white four-door Hyundai. That was it. That was the complete description. Nothing that stood out, no dent in the quarter panel or crack in the windshield or maybe missing a hubcap. Just a white four-door Hyundai Elantra. This white Hyundai Elantra is rather important because this car is basically what law enforcement is basing their entire case around. Now, it was determined to be a 2011 to 2013 Hyundai Elantra by an FBI expert with over 30 years of experience in the field. Now, when they released this alert, they don't show a picture of the actual car. Now, law enforcement claims that they have all of this video and all of these images of this car driving around the house the night of the crimes. But when they post the be on the lookout for this white Hyundai Elantra, they don't post a picture of the actual car. They post a stock photo. So, at this point, I realize that their images can't be that clear because they don't have a license plate. On the alert itself, it says white four-door Hyundai Elantra without license plate. So they don't have a license plate image from this car. So I'm assuming that they have clear video all the way around the car, other than the rear of the car. Now, they also don't know how many occupants are inside this car, which that gets me thinking, what kind of video do they have if they don't know how many occupants are in the car and they don't have a clear shot of the license plate on this car? Now, it seemed rather odd that law enforcement would put this out there. It seemed kind of strange that they would put out such a broad, description of this car. I mean, basically all they said was be on the lookout for a white Hyundai Elantra, 4 doors, between the years of 2011, 2013. So that could be a million cars. So what really surprises me is that it surprises me that somebody didn't stop and say, hey, we don't have any description on this car. This is going to flood our tip line. Because everybody probably sees a number of white four-door Hyundai Elantras when they're out driving around. So it always kind of confused me as to why they would put out this description knowing that it was going to flood their tip lines with a ton of random, sightings of this white four-door Hyundai Elantra. I mean, if they flood their tip line, Chief Fry said that they were looking into 22,000 leads on Hyundai Elantras. Now, there were less than 50 Hyundai Elantras registered in the town of Moscow, Idaho in October of 2022. That's what is reported. Less than 50. Now, that wouldn't have mattered because Brian Koberger's car wasn't registered in Idaho. It was registered in Pennsylvania, where his home is located. But there's less than 50 Hyundai Elantras registered in Moscow, Idaho, and they had over 22,000 leads on the tip line from people who are seeing this car around. Of course, you're going to have 1 million calls into the tip line because you're asking for people to call in for a white 4-door Hyundai Elantra. It's an extremely common car. So it always made me wonder, was law enforcement really looking for this car, or were they intentionally flooding their tip line by design? That's always kind of got me thinking, is why would they put out such a broad description of this car knowing that it was going to flood their tip lines? It almost seems like they flooded their tip lines intentionally, which, in my opinion, isn't really the best way to go about it, because then you might be missing out on tips that are coming in that actually have true merit and have substance, because you're too busy following all these leads for a white 4-door sedan that you're going to have millions of. Now, we know, and I've talked to a few people who are local to this area, that people did call the tip line and never received a response back from law enforcement. Is it because they were too busy dealing with all the calls coming in for the white 4-door Hyundai? That just seems like a very odd thing for law enforcement to do, unless it was something that they were doing intentionally. Now, the Daily Mail drove the route that law enforcement believes that Brian Koberger took from his apartment to the house at 1122 King Road. So in the PCA, law enforcement describes the route that Brian Koberger took, and the Daily Mail went out and drove that route. Well, one thing that the Daily Mail says is that it wasn't a very efficient route to get from Brian Koberger's apartment to the 1122 King Road house. As a matter of fact, it was filled with like detours and driving out of the way and, just going out of the way, which, in my opinion, would explain that they were basically trying to piece together Brian Koberger's route, the route of this white Hyundai, through like camera footage and security cams. So it's very possible that they weren't even following the same car in each video. How they would have to confirm that every single video was an image of the same exact car, which might explain why this car seems to be driving all over in between Pullman, Washington, and Moscow, Idaho. Because it's very possible it could be a number of cars. It may not even be the same car. Now, law enforcement had connected this white 4-door Hyundai Elantra to Brian Koberger basically on a lucky draw. An officer at Washington State University was looking through their records of vehicles that students who attend Washington State University own. And by the luck of the draw, he plucked Brian Koberger's white 2015 Hyundai Elantra out of what I'm sure was many, many, many 4-door Hyundai Elantras. belonging to students at Washington State University. So Washington State University at this time has an attendance of almost 25,000 students. And out of 25,000 students, this officer plucks Bryan Kohberger out of this group. And that's how they connect the white Hyundai Elantra to Bryan Kohberger. Now, the only problem is Bryan Kohberger's white Hyundai Elantra is a 2015. So it doesn't fit within the years of Hyundai Elantra that the FBI expert with over 30 years of experience had described that this car was in the video. So what did they do? They expand the years. So now the expert says, well, it might not have just been a 2011 to 2013. It could have been a 2011 to 2016. So now, magically, Bryan Kohberger's car now fits into the description of the car that law enforcement is looking for. Imagine that. Now, Bryan Kohberger and his white Hyundai Elantra do not leave the area after the crimes occur. Bryan Kohberger stays in Pullman, Washington, and drives his white Hyundai Elantra around Pullman, Washington, Moscow, Idaho, and pretty much drives his car around as if everything was normal. Now, in the middle of December, Bryan Kohberger and his dad set off to drive back home to Pennsylvania. So it's the holiday season. So all the kids are going home for winter break. Now, one thing that's always bothered me about this part of the case is that media would make it sound as though Bryan Kohberger was fleeing the area. Law enforcement finally caught up with him in Pennsylvania. You know, they made it sound like this crazy manhunt for Bryan Kohberger, when really it wasn't like that at all. Basically, Bryan Kohberger was going back home for winter break. He didn't leave the area after the crimes occurred. He lived his life just like normal. So it wasn't this crazy manhunt for Bryan Kohberger. It wasn't the situation where, oh, we finally caught up with him in Pennsylvania. He wasn't fleeing. He was never fleeing. You know, on Bryan Kohberger's trip back to Pennsylvania, him and his father get pulled over twice by law enforcement. So it wasn't like law enforcement didn't know where Bryan Kohberger was. Law enforcement knew exactly where Bryan Kohberger was. They had eyes on Bryan Kohberger at this point, and they were following him to Pennsylvania. So Bryan Kohberger was never fleeing this scene. So Bryan Kohberger and his dad returned to their home in Pennsylvania. And this is where law enforcement begins surveilling Bryan Kohberger. So they're watching him take out the garbage, and they're watching him, you know, do basically day-to-day things. And he has his white four-door Hyundai Elantra there that he just drove across country. And when Bryan Kohberger is arrested at his home in Pennsylvania, a lot of sources are coming out with information about this car. Now, one of the sources says that they saw Bryan Kohberger cleaning his car days before he was arrested. He was cleaning it out. He was really detailing this car days before he was arrested. Now, my question is that why wouldn't Bryan Kohberger have done this a month ago? Why would Bryan Kohberger just be getting around to cleaning possible evidence out of his car a month after these crimes occurred? After he's driven this car all around Pullman, Washington, and Moscow, Idaho, and then drove the car 2,500 miles home to Pennsylvania. Why wouldn't he clean out his car before he did that, if he was trying to, clean up any evidence. That just doesn't make sense to me. Now, when Bryan Kohberger's arrested, obviously they're going to process this 2015 white four-door Hyundai Elantra. Now, this is a big deal because this car is key in solving this crime. So everybody's excited to see all of the evidence that they're going to get from this car. So people were rather shocked to learn that there was no evidence in this car. There was no DNA from the victims. There was nothing from the victims in this car. So that became a real head scratcher. Because how did Bryan Kohberger take the lives of 4 individuals with a sharp-edged blade in a very, very messy crime scene and not leave a trail in his car, not take any of the crime scene back to his car? How does that happen? And that's one of the aspects of this case that have a lot of people confused. So although this 2015 white four-door Hyundai Elantra seems to be the center of this investigation, it doesn't really seem to be giving up a lot of information. Now, law enforcement followed this car on video driving around the house. They believe that he drove past this house, possibly 3 times and was possibly casing the house that night. Now, this car then is being followed from Pullman, Washington to Moscow, Idaho, from Moscow, Idaho back to Pullman, Washington. And then this car is being tracked all the way over to Pennsylvania. So this little white Hyundai is really important. And it doesn't seem to be adding up to what law enforcement is telling us that this white Hyundai should be. It's not really adding up. So, although this may seem just like a car to a lot of people, this white Hyundai is a really, really important aspect of this investigation. So I felt like it was really important to just talk about this car. Something simple, something easy, but something that's monumental in this case. Now stay tuned for my next video, and please like and subscribe to my channel if you like my content. I really appreciate it. We'll see you next time.